In a video I made a few months ago ranking every Souls game, when discussing Dark Souls 1, a topic I discussed quite a bit about the game was how its second half gets a bit too overblown on how bad it is. So essentially, I'm just going to get straight into going into it a bit more in depth, while also shitting on an actual underwhelming half of a game with the first half of Dark Souls 3. Alright, so let me make it clear that yes, the first half of the game, Dark Souls 1, up until you retrieve the Lord Vessel from Anor Londo, is absolutely stronger than the remaining portion of the game. The main reason for this being the difference in level and world design, the first half being an expansive interconnected labyrinth where you have a lot of choice and variation on what order you do things in, having an actual goal but not being completely shoved in your face. And the second half being completely simplistic in its level design, with losing the interconnectivity in favour of a far more linear style. This isn't the only reason for the second half being inferior. The atmosphere isn't as palpable as in the first few locations, although a few levels do have a prominent atmosphere in the second half, and the bosses are, for the most part, less enjoyable. Not like Dark Souls 1 overall is the pinnacle of boss quality or anything, but still. So when people think of the second half, they usually think of 4 areas: Duke's Archives, New Londo, Tomb of the Giants, and Lost Izalith. Sure, makes sense as these are the 4 areas that your overall objectives lie in. However, there's a few more areas that people don't really consider as second half areas, when in reality, they are. Darkroot Garden, the Catacombs, and the Painted World of Ariamis are absolutely second half areas, shown by either the placement in the story or by the difficulty of the area, or both. For example, to be able to fight the 4 kings, you need to acquire the ring from Artorias' grave and from Sif, which obviously requires you to go through the Darkroot Garden. The placement in the story and also the difficulty of the enemies show you that you're not supposed to be in this area before you retrieve the Lord Vessel. Another example being the Catacombs. There's pretty much no reason for you to go down there other than to defeat Nito. Yeah, I guess you can go down here and be a hero and save the maiden that got lost down there, or on your future playthroughs, go down there to defeat Pinwheel for the Rite of Kindling. But on your first playthrough, if you go down there before getting the Lord Vessel, you're just gonna get bodied. Just because it's accessible doesn't mean you're meant to go there early on. You can reach the Tomb of the Giants early on as well. Does that mean it counts as a first half area? I don't think so. Look, I enjoy going to areas in Dark Souls 1 underleveled. There's something satisfying in games about doing things out of order, but I can't cry when I get murked by Pinwheel or something when I decide to go into the late game areas early. Not that I ever died to Pinwheel, by the way. Almost, but fortunately I don't have that shame on my conscience. Anyway, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent. Basically, the areas that are second half areas that people don't acknowledge are of a good quality. Darkroot Garden is one of my favourite areas in the game, with its strong atmosphere, fighting through the human defenders of Artorias' grave, to the end of the level with the emotional fight with Sif. The Catacombs can be a bit tedious and frustrating, but again, that's down to me usually going through this area early. At the appropriate level, this area is decent. Ariamis is a solid optional area, and also the optional return to the Undead Asylum is pretty cool. I'm always a fan of going back to the area where the game started. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into the 4 main areas of the second half. Alright, so let's start off with the Duke's Archives, which I believe to be the best area of the latter half of Dark Souls 1, and honestly, one of the better areas in the whole game in general for me. I enjoy the whole aspect of Seath canonically being the only thing to kill the player in the game, and having to essentially break out of jail. I mean, not like it's an elaborate scheme to break out. Yeah, you probably should have taken my weapons away before imprisoning me, buddy. The level design is pretty good once escaping the prison, with manipulating these staircases to access a few sections to get a few items, and eventually finding the route to progress to the Crystal Caves. The enemies overall I like, I'd say. The generic enemies are basically a slightly enhanced version of regular hollows. These kidnappers are cool apart from them teleporting once taking a bit of damage. The maidens in the jail have a great design, Which reminds me, the lore of the Duke's Archives is interesting, being a place where Seath has gone mad, trying to figure out how to become immortal as he's disabled. Why does he have tentacles, by the way? And also the Archives essentially being the birthplace of sorcery. Reaching the outside of the Archives, honestly this area hurts my eyes. It looks like vomit. There's a few oddly placed golems which are decent enemies, but here they're just standing in random corners, facing the wall like a form of punishment from a parent. Yeah, this area is dead, but you can literally run through it in like 15 seconds, so whatever. I see a lot of people shit on the Crystal Caves, but I don't really get why. It's a harmless area that looks pretty, and it's not exactly hard to figure out how to get through. It's not like the environment here is as treacherous as Tomb of the Giants. Yeah, there's a few golems blocking a couple of paths, but it's not like they are impossible to navigate around. I don't know, it's just a nice looking area. I don't get where all the negative feelings come from here. And the Seath boss fight is pretty arse mechanically. 90% of the boss is me trying to slice his tail off. Although I do like that little aspect of it being a rematch and revenge for what he did to you earlier. I always like in Souls game where your character has a bit of a personal rivalry or grudge with a boss, like Genichiro from Sekiro and especially Morgott from Elden Ring. Yeah, obviously here it's to a much lesser level, but you get what I mean. Yeah, so overall I pretty much have no problem with this whole level. To be fair, I think in general, this area does get a bit less stick from the players than the other 3 remaining areas, so let's move on. The first part of New Londo before draining the water is pretty meh. The ghosts are extremely irritating. It's a bit tedious, meticulously going through, drawing ghosts out 1 or 2 at a time to kill them. Rushing through seems like a nightmare. But once draining the water, the newly accessible part of the level is a short but sweet area. The first and main aspect I enjoy most about this part is the actually quite eerie atmosphere of it. It's extremely dark and quiet, with drowned, mushy corpses of the inhabitants strewn about all over the place. Dark wraiths hiding around corners, and these abominations lurking about, make this the most horror-themed section of the game. I believe that Dark Souls 1 has one of the most prominent atmospheres in gaming. Also, the main enemy here, the Dark Wraiths, are a very fun enemy to fight in general. Four Kings, I actually do like this boss fight more than any of the other second half bosses. Not like the competition is exactly tough though. It does have a few questionable hitboxes, but apart from that it's solid. I fought them very long ago at a very low level with a barely upgraded weapon for the purpose of meeting Karth in the Abyss, as I had never seen him there before. Yeah, never doing that shit again. Yeah, so overall, the first 2 levels of the second half of Dark Souls 1 I have positive feelings for. However, these next 2 areas, people just do not like at all, so I'm gonna have a harder time defending them. Now, Tomb of the Giants I really can't defend as the area does just really stink. However, I will stand up for Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith, not for the sake of playing devil's advocate, but because I genuinely like these areas. Okay, maybe not like, but I don't dislike them. It's definitely not as horrendous as everyone says it is. The only problems I really have with this area is of course this garbage boss and the 20-minute run back to it. Well, actually, Ceaseless Discharge is pretty arse as well, and Demon Fire Sage is garbage. Okay, the bosses in this area are quite shit, although I actually do like the Centipede Demon despite its irritating arena. Okay, so I'm not exactly doing a great job on defending these areas. Let's talk about the positives. Firstly, the look and design of everything for me is great. I love the ruined Aztec style architecture. I don't know if this is actually Aztec style, but you know what I mean. Intertwined with the fiery, smouldering landscape. I didn't play the original release of Dark Souls 1, so I wasn't blinded by this lake of lava when going through it. But yeah, this place is full of demons, which reminds me that the lore here is very interesting, with this place being the birthplace of demons. The enemy variation is quite abundant here. Yes, there's a bunch of Taurus and Capra demons just copy and pasted in the Demon Ruins. This always makes me laugh. Still, fighting them as normal enemies is fun and works as it's kind of an indication on how strong your character has become by mowing down these enemies that were once a singular boss. Apart from that, these giant worms and whatever the fuck these are pretty cool. Oh right, yeah, these statue gargoyle enemies exist as well. Probably the most basic enemy in the game. Oh yeah, and how could I forget these random dragon asses just strewn about the lava lake? Does anyone even try to fight these? This whole massive lake area here is the only level design that I believe is genuinely bad. The rest of the level is fine, with navigating through the ruins, scaling branches to get around. Alright, so going through this, it's only really the bosses that are universally shit in Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith. The rest of the area is fine, not the abomination that everyone makes it out to be. I get bosses are high up on people's lists on when thinking about their favourite features of Souls games, and they are for me also. However, I value these games for more than being just boss rushes, and apart from the bosses, these two levels offer a decent degree in quality in other aspects. It's nowhere near the best area in the game or anything like that, but the point of this video is to defend these areas from people saying how shit they are, and how shit the second half of the game is. Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith, they're just not that bad. However, Tomb of the Giants is that bad. Yeah, sorry, Tomb of the Giants, you're on your own here. I can't back you. I can't see shit. Skeletons are constantly knocking you off cliffs. These annoying skeleton dogs exist, and the boss Nito is severely underwhelming for me. I hate how involved the skeletons are in this fight. This area has a good atmosphere, but that's about it. Worst area in the game by far. Finally, once all the Lord Souls are delivered to the Lord Vessel, the final run to Gwyn at the end of the game is always forgotten about. Yeah, it's not a fully fledged area, but fighting through the last defense of Black Knights in this beautiful looking scorched ashy ruin before finally taking on Gwyn always made this finale to the game memorable for me. So I think I've made my case on why the second half of Dark Souls 1 is not absolute trash. Yes, as I have said, it loses its intricate intertwined level and world design, but not losing the actual quality on the levels themselves. Well, mostly. If people didn't shit on the second half, and simply instead just said it's not as good as the first half without butchering it, I wouldn't make this video, but I will not take the slander regurgitated about the second half of this 14-year-old game. Now, let's discuss the first half of Dark Souls 3, which is actually shit. I have a lot of problems with Dark Souls 3 in general. I believe that the bosses really saved that game, as the levels and areas, atmosphere and the lore are lacking throughout. These aspects improve once reaching Irithyll, which I suppose is about halfway through the game, maybe a bit over. The game throughout is very linear and straightforward, much like the second half of Dark Souls 1. Now, as I said before, being linear does not mean bad. As long as the levels are of a good quality, then it doesn't really matter. The problem is, Dark Souls 3 has a lot of underwhelming, dull areas throughout, but especially in the first half. The High Wall of Lothric I never really liked as a starting area. I don't really know why, I just think it's very dull. This might seem a bit of a nitpick and also a bit of a skill issue, but having such a few amount of Estus flasks in the starting area, and for quite a large level as well, is a bit jarring. Quite a few times I got hit too much and would have to go all the way back to a bonfire. I mean, yeah, that is kind of the case with all of these games, but I think it stands out a lot here. Yeah, as I said, it is a bit of a skill issue, I suppose, but I still believe my point stands on that. To be fair, there is like a new bonfire every 20 steps in this game. Undead Settlement is always a slog to get through. The enemies mostly stink. The Cursed Greatwood is one of the worst bosses in the series, and just the whole look of the area just makes me feel sick. There's a few redeeming qualities, like meeting quite a lot of new characters, and the actual level design is honestly quite solid, but still, another meh area. Road of Sacrifices is boring and forgettable. Farron Keep is honestly alright, This area gets hated on a bit too much, I feel. It's got a strong atmosphere, which is quite rare for this game, and it ends with the best boss fight up until this point. The catacombs are a great solution for insomnia. The diverging optional area from the catacombs, the Smouldering Ruins, is easily one of the shittest areas in the series, with its unnecessarily massive open space, being sniped constantly by this javelin, and fighting through a ton of extremely irritating enemies. This area should have been cut down in size by half. The only first half area I have positive feelings for is the Cathedral of the Deep. Once getting inside the cathedral anyway, the outside and getting into the cathedral isn't exactly great. In fact, it's pretty shit to be honest. Running across the rooftops, getting constantly blasted by arrows and jumped by these things is irritating. Oh, and the graveyard as well, with these maggot corpses and enemies that make you bleed for like 10 years as a result of getting hit once. Yeah, maybe the Cathedral of the Deep isn't that good actually, but yeah, once you get inside the cathedral it picks up. So yeah, the first half areas are shit, to put it bluntly. Compare them to the second half areas and it's night and day. And I don't even think that many areas of the second half are top tier either, but definitely a rise in quality over the first half. A significant reason why Dark Souls 3 areas are lackluster is that it quite frankly looks dead and ugly, and lacks the palpable atmosphere of FromSoft's previous games. I always say atmosphere is extremely important to get right, and unfortunately Dark Souls 3 gets it wrong. It's always hard for me to explain why and how atmosphere is stronger in some games than others. It's hard to pinpoint what can make a prominent atmosphere. I guess it's just an accumulation of everything from art design, ambience, use of music and so on. Anyway, Dark Souls 3 is just fucking bland. Every time I play this game I just get bored on how dull, grey and washed out everything looks. Yeah, you might say Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne look dead and decrepit also. Yeah, but I mean from the point of Dark Souls 3, the whole colour and just how everything looks, it just looks washed out. Right, this is kind of a criticism for the whole game in general, so let me bring it back to the first half of the game, which is the point of the video. I said earlier that the bosses save this game, making up for the various other flaws I mentioned. I would say that Dark Souls 3 is considered by players as the entry that has the best bosses throughout FromSoft's history. Now, I would agree if it weren't for the bosses in the first half. Just like the levels and areas, the bosses in the first half of the game are overall shit, which everyone seems to gloss over. Gundyr and Vort are decent starting bosses, but then the rest up until Pontiff are arse. Well, apart from the Abyss Watchers, and even they are gassed up a bit too much for my liking. How can Dark Souls 3 have the best boss roster when it consists of Cursed Greatwood, Crystal Sage, Deacons of the Deep and Wolnir? But nah, seriously, I get why people say Dark Souls 3 has the best bosses, as a result of the bosses in the second half being brilliant, and in the DLC of course also. One thing I want to mention is, again, Dark Souls 3 as a whole, is the lore is very underwhelming. I'm adding this as a complaint to the first half of the game, mainly the very start, as finding out that I have to gather more powerful souls for the third game in a row is a bit disappointing. Can we think of a new premise? No? Okay, alright, I've made my case on why the first half of Dark Souls 3 is fucking mid or worse, and how Dark Souls 1 second half, contrary to belief, is underrated and not deserving of the hate it gets. Now it's your turn to defend Dark Souls 3 against me. Do you disagree with facts? Also, feel free to shit on Dark Souls 1 second half in the comments as well. It's not like I'll be hearing anything new or unique. I don't know how people with a straight face can state that Dark Souls second half bad, Dark Souls 3 first half good. I think the reason for people shitting on the second half is because the first half of Dark Souls 1 is pretty perfect, to be honest. There's really not a lot wrong with it, so that any sort of drop off urges people to get petulant and just call it shit. Anyway, that's enough of me defending a 14-year-old game. Goodbye.